Hello and welcome to this online lesson. My name is Mr. Hoven and today we will be starting a new unit, the Cold War and the Changing Global Role of America. And we're going to be focusing on the beginning of the Cold War. It lasted from roughly 1947 to 1991 and it was pitting two world superpowers against one another, the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, this was a different kind of war. Wasn't necessarily strictly a war on military where soldiers were fighting one another, but it was also a war of ideas. And the big focus was on communism, containing it, not letting it spread. And remember from class, communism is an economic system where all wealth and property are owned by the government. Keep that in mind as we begin this unit. So before the Cold War even began, in 1945, the Big Three, Winston Churchill of Great Britain, Stalin from the Soviet Union, and FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, met at Yalta on the Black Sea, that was a port of the Soviet Union, to discuss post-war Europe after World War II. They came to discuss issues such as the Soviet Union agreeing to enter the war against Japan. In return, the Soviets would receive territories in Asia. That was pretty easy to settle. However, other parts of the Yalta Conference were much more difficult to come to an agreement on. The US and Britain were fearing the spread of communism, while the Soviet Union wanted to establish a buffer zone against any future attacks, especially from Germany. So, with this tension between the three, they began to try to work out some agreements with one another. First, Poland. Poland was recognized as its own country, but it was set up by the Soviets. The U.S. would allow this as long as free elections took place. There was the Declaration of Liberated Europe. All people can choose the form of government under which they live. So all these new lands recently freed from Germany by the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union had the ability to choose or vote on how their government would represent them. And finally, the question of Germany. What to do with these Germans? So they split Germany into 4 zones, and Berlin was divided. So if you look at this map here, here is a map of Germany. And as you can see, you've got different areas controlled by Great Britain, by the Soviet Union, by the United States, and France. So that was split up. And the capital right here, Berlin, was split into 4 sections. Each section or sector was controlled by a different group. You had the Soviet sector, you had the American sector, the British, and the French. Now, the Soviets were not happy with the outcome of the Yalta Conference and would begin to violate the parameters of the conference, which would lead to growing tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union over the next 44 years. So distrust soon arose between the Western governments in Europe and the United States and the Soviet Union. Stalin set up many of his own governments, and he kept Soviet forces in Eastern Europe, areas like Poland, Finland, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Romania, areas of present-day Ukraine. And Europe began splitting into 2 armed camps, armed meaning they were building up weapons in an arms race. The communist Eastern Europe and the democratic Western Europe. And early on, Winston Churchill warned the rest of the world of this possibility of the spreading communist power throughout Europe and Asia. Winston Churchill believed the division between East and West was permanent, and he stated in a speech in Fulton, Missouri in 1946 that an iron curtain had descended across the continent from the Baltic to the Adriatic. So looking at this map here, this iron curtain that split Germany in half, put the Czech Republic on the eastern side with the Soviet Union. You had this kind of unofficial border between the Soviet states in Europe and the westernized or more democratic or capitalist states in Western Europe. So you've got this Iron Curtain that descended across the continent, and it goes from the Baltic Sea up here down to the Adriatic right down there. This kind of set the stage for a line in the sand between democratic principles and communist principles, leading to greater tensions between the US and the Soviet Union. So, to halt Soviet expansion, or to keep it from moving beyond its borders or what it already controlled, President Truman adopted a firm policy of containment. Under this policy, the United States would contain the Soviets by any means necessary, whether it be military means or by peaceful or diplomatic means, and to ensure that communism did not spread to more countries. Simply stated, the United States would contain communism to where it was and not allow it to spread out. And some early examples of the containment policy at work. It went into effect early on after it was instated by President Truman. Civil war had raged in Greece as communists attempted to overthrow the country's pro-Western government. At the same time, the Soviets were pressuring Turkey to give them naval bases on the straits leading to the Mediterranean Sea. In March 1947, Truman asked Congress for money to help Greece and Turkey. This was known as the Truman Doctrine, and it provided immediate aid in the form of money and other goods to the Greeks and the Turks. In the long run, this doctrine pledged that the United States would fight the spread of communism worldwide. So now, we're completely going against President Washington's farewell address. Stay out of foreign affairs. We're completely involved. We've committed. Wherever communism is spreading, we will get involved to stop the spread and contain it. Another example of the containment policy in action was the Marshall Plan. In 1947, Secretary of State George Marshall proposed that the American people and the American country give massive economic aid to Western European countries. After the communist takeover of Czechoslovakia, Congress approved this plan. From 1948 through 1951, the Marshall Plan pumped $13 billion worth of supplies, machinery, and food into Western Europe. And this economic recovery began to weaken the appeal of communism. Communism thrives on poverty because it makes everyone equal. So there really, quote unquote, isn't poverty. But in a way, there still is quite a few things wrong with it. So all this money being pumped into Western and parts of Eastern Europe began to kind of get people's minds changing. Maybe communism isn't the way to go. I hope you enjoyed this online lesson. Next time, we'll be looking at the crisis in Berlin, the Berlin blockade, the Berlin airlift. We'll also focus more on the two armed camps in the world and looking at communism beginning to spread in Asia. We'll see you next time.